Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Keegan Chetwynd, the director of the Military Aviation Museum, and it's my great pleasure to have you all here with us for another of our ongoing series of aviation history webinars. Joining us tonight is Boom Powell, author, historian, museum volunteer, and museum pilot, who's actually written the book on Ben Drew, an American ace from World War II who was notable for having flown the P-51 and scored some early jet kills. And of course, we're going to learn a little bit about that. Boom's going to tell us more about his post-war experiences as well and where his career as an aviator took him in the post-war world. Just as a quick aside, the book is available from the museum store. So to reserve your copy, you can call the store in the morning and Tammy will have them available for you. You're welcome to drop by and pick them up as well. It is not currently listed in our online store, though that is something we hope to remedy. We're about ready to get started. I think that's probably about enough from me because you wanted me to go short on the intro. Are you ready?
We can do that as soon as you say, Keegan, is no problem. Always a pleasure to be invited to do one of these things for all the, well, not just the volunteers I found out, but other people that find out about these webinars and go ahead and talk about it. It's always great when you meet a character who is fairly historically important in doing that. So for a start, I'm going to tell you how I met Ben Drew, Urban Drew, to begin with. Once upon a time, back when, I was happily flying Navy jets, as a matter of fact, right out of Oceana up the road and living here in Virginia Beach. I had been promoted, I'd made commander, but because of my unusual aviation background, my next set of orders were somewhat problematical. So sure, I talked to Washington for a while and they came up with and says, how about something overseas and doing this, take the family, can go on one of these. And I said, sure, it sounds interesting. And all of a sudden, next thing you know, I was the naval attaché to the Republic of South Africa with an office in Pretoria. It was different. The country itself was thing, and I could probably do entire presentations on that, but just getting used to the new routine and the new job and everything was still kind of strange. I'd been on the post less than 3 weeks. When the Marine at the desk called up to my office and says, Commander, he says, we have a Mr. Urban Drew here to see the air attaché. Well, the air attaché and the defense attaché had been asked to leave the country in cover of a scandal that happened just before I got there. And since I was an aviator, it was a natural thing that I took over the duties of the air attaché. And I says, certainly, send him up. And that is how I got to meet Ben Drew. He came into the office, introduced himself, of course, as Urban, not Ben at that point, and said, and I said, well, what can I do to help you, Mr. Drew? And he said, well, I've got this little bit of a problem, but first I've got to give you some background. So here, skipping parts of it, is basically what he said to me the first time. He mentioned, of course, right off the bat that he was an ace from World War II, flying P-51 Mustangs. And you can imagine my ears perked up on that. But then he kept going. He said, so after the war, what wound up doing like that, I wound up flying for some charter airlines, and eventually he and some other airline captains founded their own airline called 7 Seas. So they had basically some DC-4s. They operated primarily out of Northern Europe. They had offices in Luxembourg, and they had some wonderful charters going on. One of the charters they had was to work with the United Nations down there in the Belgian Congo. Excuse me, at the time, the Congo. There was a civil war going down there, and the UN had a major input to events that were happening. And so he was very interested in doing that thing, a very lucrative and a very nice contract. 7 Seas had some interesting things going for them, though. Anyway, they had 2 strato freighters, civilian, the only 2 civilian C-97s that were in existence, had these 2 giant airplanes. They also had a couple of old Curtiss Commandos, C-46s operating there. They'd actually set up a base in Elizabethville in the Congo and doing operations down there. Well, as Ben tells the story, things were going great, money was going great, the flights were going great, and all of a sudden these characters showed up from the US government. Shh, you can't say that though. put a little pressure on them, and they offered him a great deal of money to fly a very special mission for them. So what they did is one of those C-97s they had went to France and picked up 5 fuselages for Fuga Magister's complete aircraft. The Fuga Magister's, though designed as a trainer, also was a counterinsurgency airplane. It could fire rockets, it could carry machine guns, and was very usable. And of course, they were forbidden to go into the thing. The side note, the crew that picked up the airplane that time estimates that there was enough ammunition and weapons in the belly of the airplane to put them about 10,000 pounds over the maximum gross weight. They delivered the airplanes, and there they were in the middle of the Civil War going on down there. Well, when the United Nations people found out about this deal, they said, that's it, forget it. And the UN contract went away. And all of a sudden, the Seven Seas was gone. They were bankrupt, no real source of money. And what's he going to do now? So as Ben tells it, he kind of wandered around Europe a little bit with one of his partners from the airline and said, what's going on? In the meantime, he got a telegram from Washington saying, come see us, we want to talk to you. And he ignored the first one, the second one, and maybe even the third one. And then finally, this guy who he's with said to him, says, Ben, at least go and see what the guy want to talk about. And sure enough, he reported to Washington, D.C. He says it was a classic. It was an almost empty office in downtown Washington. Gentleman with a 3-piece suit talked to him and says, we want you to form an airline and get organized. And he said, no way. He says, you guys screwed me over so badly before. There's no way I want to work with you again. They looked at him and said, Mr. Drew, if you want to work in aviation ever again, you will set up an airline for us. So there he was organizing an airline in this little lovely place out here. This is Tan Sanut in Saigon in Vietnam. He set up an airline using DC-3s and C-47s and doing that and working it all the way through in the thing. They did several night operations that went on. He says it was very unusual. There'd be a bunch of Chinese nationalists that would get on the airplane as paratroops and go out in the evening, and the airplane would come back empty later on that night. Eventually, he managed to convince himself and get himself out of that airline business and do something on his own, obtained an airplane, and worked with monkeys, bringing monkeys back to the United States for research purposes. That business lasted for a while and it finally died out because, one, the serums were no longer being researched and stuff using live monkeys, and of course the Vietnam War was starting. So now is a question of what are we going to do next? He says, so here I am, after many adventures. I'm living in South Africa. He married a South African. He was running an airline called Capri Air, using C4 DC-3s, actually 2 of them were C-47s, converted into passenger carrying. And he was going to run an airline up in what was formerly Southwest Africa and then became Namibia, which was also having a little bit of a civil war type situation up there. He says, my problem is the South Africans don't trust me anymore. They're trying to make it so that I can't run my airline. I want you to tell them I am no longer associated in any way with the CIA. I laughed at him. I said, Mr. Drew, think about this. You want me to, number one, admit that there's CIA in South Africa. Number two, that I know who they are. And number three, I'm going to tell them that you're not one of them. He sat back and relaxed a little bit on his own and kind of said, yeah, I can kind of see your point. We can't do that. Anyway, that's how we met. We became friends. I spent a lot of time at his house when we were over there, and I learned a great deal more about his adventures, both during World War II and then afterwards. He became famous in several ways, some of them even accidentally. When he joined the squadron, he went out there. He managed a ground kill on his very first mission, which of course the 8th Air Force counted as significant. He shot down one other airplane, an ME-109. And then one day when they had a day off from any missions, he was a little bit late in leaving the barracks to go visit London, or they do in a day off. When the group commander came in, Colonel Christian, and said, pack up, we're briefing at noon. We got a special deal we're doing for the thing. And they launched this flight. Probably one of the most famous pictures taken during World War II. It was naturally taken in color. It's not colorized. They put Air Forces, Air Corps photographers in a B-17 and shot a whole series. Besides the formation work, they also shot the individual airplanes as they're going through that. Ben is flying Easy to Sugar in the foreground. Side note for your aircraft identification people, makes this an interesting picture. There's actually 3 models of the P-51 in this photograph. In the far back, number 4 position is a P-51B, the old greenhouse canopy on the thing called Susie G, which we'll talk about again later on. The commander is flying one of the first of the P-51s that had been a P-47 wing group before. And one of the early P-51Ds that arrived and had the thing going. The Sky Bouncer is also an early one, and then Ben is flying an Easy to Sugar, one of the newest ones. The difference you'll notice is there's a fillet on the back end of Easy to Sugar where the rudder goes, up to the rudder. They discovered without the fillet on the thing, it was unstable in a high-speed gunnery room. So he was in the series of famous photographs that was taken at the same time. He had actually joined up and gone into, this was the 361st Fighter Group, and he was in the 375th Squadron. The group emblem is up there on the top, and then below it is the squadron emblem they use with the Donald Duck character on the thing. For his 3rd victory, he wound up going one-on-one with a Messerschmitt 109 over Rostock in Germany, eventually shooting him down. I cover it in great detail in the book. But an artist named Troy White, who wanted to get involved in aviation illustrations, had read a draft of the book and said that would make a great illustration. And he painted the painting above, called basically 1 versus 1. It's still available as a print. The original is 44 inches by 34 inches, and I understand it sold for over $2,000, even though I never did find out who would wind up buying it. After that mission, he had another great claim to fame of sinking the world's largest flying boat at the time. He had flown on an escort mission, and then over the Baltic, he had spotted a Heinkel 111 down on the water and went down and shot the airplane down. On the way home, as they passed over a seaplane base, they spotted this giant flying boat, and he and his 2 wingmen strafed it, and they left it burning and sinking behind them. There was some confusion as to which aircraft they had actually shot up. But at the time, they just kind of shrugged and said, that's it, we're assuming it's a Blumenvoss 238. Of course, Ben's most famous moment came when he shot down not 1, but 2 Me-262s. He was the first man to shoot down not only 2 of them, but he was the first to get sole credit. The earlier Me-262 shoot downs in Europe had been shared kills, and his was a solo all the way through. Brian Bateman did this wonderful illustration of it. Flying the airplane, he became famous in the Detroit Miss when he had it. So that was his double. This is a publicity shot taken probably at the end of his tour. If you count the markings on the cockpit side, you'll see there's 7. Has 6 aerial kills, and the 1 ground one, which the 8th Air Force credited him with. He's posed, he's saying, hey, I got the 2 Me-262s. The gentleman he's talking to, the other pilot, is Bill Kemp with a K. Kemp had been with them as a Mustang instructor in Florida, and the 2 of them misbehaved in a few military discipline problems before they got sent to England. And they continued being subtly rambunctious. And a reporter from Stars and Stripes is the one that came to him and said, okay, Kemp, bad guys acting up, and then named them the Katzenjammer Kids after a very popular comic strip at the time. And a couple of German-speaking twins that were always getting in trouble, the Katzenjammer Kids, doing that. As I say, a nice publicity shot when he had it. He went back stateside. The Air Force didn't do him any favors. He kept him in some meaningless jobs and things he didn't want. He wanted to go back to combat, and pulled a few strings and some people he knew, and he wound up getting assigned It's the 413th Fighter Group flying Thunderbolts in this case. They actually formed in North Carolina and then got sent to the West Coast for a further transport by ship to Iwo Jima. This is the P-47N, the extreme long-range version they had built of that airplane with extra fuel tankage. And some nice things for the pilot, for those who don't know, it had foldable rudder pedals, but the thing had an autopilot that actually worked, and a seat vibrator. They were figuring missions being that long to fly all the way from Iwo Jima to Japan and then return to Iwo Jima. He flew one mission in the Pacific Theater, one combat mission while he was over there like that. And that was on August 15th. That is the date when the Japan had surrendered. So the war was over. So he just did that one mission over there. Long journey getting home, got home, left the service, left the active service, and he's back home in Detroit with his mother. And his mother came in and said, the governor's on the phone. And he thought she was kidding, but he wasn't. The governor actually came on the phone and says, I want you to reform the Air National Guard again that had existed before the war, and Ben became the operations guy, #2 guy, when they reformed the Air National Guard. P-51 Mustangs, which of course is a natural form, and they also had the A-26 Douglas Invaders and flew that. Ben got checked out in the airplane on one of his first flights in the airplane with the crew chief sitting in the right seat. He says, I wonder if this airplane can do a loop. And sure enough, it could. He was enjoying it. It was good work. He was staying busy and doing a thing. However, about this time, the Air Force became independent and the money got divided up, and the Army general of the regular National Guard was kind of hogging the funds and putting things away. Ben tells a story. When they went to one of their summer, they called them encampments to fly from a remote field. The runways had potholes and were cracked. The buildings were all falling down and everything was pretty miserable. Well, Ben, in his inimitable way, rather than working through the system quietly, called up a friend of his who was a reporter for the Detroit Free Press. And this guy printed a big expose article on what was wrong with the National Guard in Michigan. The very next day after the paper appeared, the governor called him and says, Mr. Drew, I want your resignation on my desk tomorrow. And sure enough, that's when he left the service finally and had to do that. He kind of wandered and tried a couple different things. He went to work for the Fram company. The old guys will remember Fram with all the filters and problems they had on a couple of old ads. He basically was involved with sales and doing that. They had a Beech 18, so he kind of kept his hand in flying a little bit, but he really missed it too much. So sure enough, he went back to the airline business. Flew for Slick first out of California. Again, charter, larger cargo, go anywhere you want. And it was a bunch of the Slick pilots that got together and founded 7 Seas Airlines. I already mentioned the problems in Africa and his being kind of blackmailed into going and forming a new airline at Tonsanut. And the thing, this is 1954 map of Vietnam, and went with that and kind of kept going for it. And what are you going to do there? When that ended and then the drug serum thing and stopped, he said, okay, wandered over. How many of you have ever seen one of these things? He was with the company, Stuart Davis, that developed the jetpack that went on top of the C-119s and the C-123s for additional power and additional thrust. And he worked with those guys. Finally, leaving that, he wanted with some deals, wheeling and dealing. He was an entrepreneur in the truest sense of the word. He found a position brokering the sale of airliners. The biggest contract came when South African Airways was selling off all their Boeing 727s, and he wound up brokering those deals, so did very well. He was doing well enough where he maintained a flat in London. He had met a lovely lady named Lynn, who was a South African, and moved down to Pretoria to work the airlines down there. And at that point, he got the idea of let's go ahead and see if we can work out an airline of our own. When we're talking about Caprivi, for those that are unfamiliar with it, and then this is the Caprivi Strip, an oddness of geography. There was a war going on in Portuguese Angola, and the insurgents were also operating in Namibia, but this is where he proposed working an airliner in Southern Africa and going through that. Meet George Peter Ader, Luftwaffe pilot, Luftwaffe Ace, many times over on the thing. Ader was an amazing gent, 572 missions, he had 78 kills. He was probably the leading shooter of day bombers down, the 4-engine bombers. He did fly the Me-262, and he was at Achmar on the day that Ben bagged his 2 Me-262s. Through one of the veterans organizations, they got in touch with each other to describe what happened the day in Achmar, and then of course just talked the mutual stuff that fighter pilots talked about long after the war. Ben visited him in Germany, and then later on set up and invited the Aders to come down and visit him in South Africa. South African Air Force treated him very well. Their museum down there had one of the 2-place Me-262s, and the result was this rather, I think, remarkable photograph. And I came up with the 2 of them, sitting in the last of the 262s that they had out there. You can see these 2 guys with the thumbs up. Amazing story, and the 2 of them getting together. Ader provided many details that were not known otherwise of the 262s that were shot down on that particular day. Odd things that Ben got involved in. He had the C-47s and the aviation contacts in various companies, so when they filmed A Bridge Too Far, he was the lead pilot. He flew one of the C-47s, and they did all the parachute shots on the thing. Little interesting sidelight. Anyway, there he is back in Africa, and proudly on one of the airplanes, you can see the sign that says this aircraft flew the lead position when they filmed A Bridge Too Far. He was often doing it. Since the airline was unable to function, he leased his airplanes out. He flew charters. The main charter he flew was for the gambling casinos in Lesotho and Swaziland. He'd pick up a bunch of the high rollers and their wives and girlfriends, assorted hangers-on, and fly them up for a weekend in these gambling casinos on the outside of South Africa. The lovely flight attendant, by the way, is my wife. He had 2 airplanes going at once, and his wife couldn't act as a flight attendant. And he said to Marie, he said, "How'd you like to be a flight attendant?" She says, "I don't know anything about training and emergency procedures, anything else." He says, "Can you make a drink?" And she says, "Yeah, I can do that." And he says, "Good, you're a flight attendant." Loaned her a uniform, and away they went from there. Came back to the States. So this is for the Air Force American Fighter Aces Association Banquet and Convention in 1981. And I was extremely privileged to be invited to go along. This rather grainy picture is of myself with, that's Gabby Gabreski himself, and Ben and Mrs. Gabreski at that particular meeting. It was a real thrill to meet many of these aces they had. Ben came back to the States after that, actually moved back to the States. And once he'd moved back, I got a hold of him again. Actually, he got a hold of me. He called me from San Diego. He finally tracked me down and says, "How are you?" And I said, "Great, how are you doing?" And one of my comments to him was, I says, "When are you going to write that biography you keep talking about?" And he said, "When are you going to write it?" And I went, "Oh, okay." And that's how I began work on the book with all the research. This is Bob Mccandless. Literally interesting people you wind up meeting when you're working on a book like this. You can see his wartime pictures, including the one where he was a prisoner of war. The mission where Ben shot down the 2 Me-262s, he was shot down and had the thing going, was captured and a prisoner until the end of the war. The paper is, by the way, the correct color was actually orange paper on the prisoner records that they did use in the thing. After the war, he got out. After he was discharged when the war ended, after coming home, he went to MIT and became, of all interesting things, a nautical engineer with a master's degree. Worked for Electric Boat, building the first nuclear submarines. And then when the Litton Company was building frigates down there in Alabama, he moved down to Pascagoula, where I got to go down and interview him several times. A real gentleman and a bright guy. Typical of engineering, by the way, he decided to make this. He didn't call it a drawing, he called it a rendering. And that was the view he had of the gunner that shot him down, a ground gunner who thinks a 20-millimeter cannon going. The white dots are his stuff in the gun sight, and the purple blob is the one that went into his wing and set his airplane on fire. Back to the book. So there we are. I already showed you the illustration that White, what White got up doing for the thing and doing that sort of thing. So we had the rough sketch going. As I say, Troy had picked this drawing out because he liked the angles of it. It would be an interesting picture of the thing. We didn't think it. I showed the rough sketch to Ben, just this pencil sketch going on. You can see the name. And Ben goes, well, we can change that. That's not the Susie. We can change that to the Detroit Miss, can't we? It was my airplane. And both Troy and I looked at him and we said, hey, sorry, Ben, you were actually flying Susie G on that day. So there it was, Susie G, besides taking the photograph. We missed an opportunity. At that time, we could have had that prints, as people do all the time, autographed by 4 different people. Troy, as the artist, could have signed it. Ben Drew, of course, could have signed it. Frank Glankler, who was a cotton broker in Memphis, Tennessee, could have signed it. And his wife, Susie Glankler, could have signed that same print. But it didn't happen, so we go on from there. The flying boat, the great flying boat. Like I said, there was confusion. The gun camera film was illegible, unreadable, and they couldn't figure out what it was. They looked through the recognition manuals, and they weren't really sure of what they had going for this illustration by Stan Stokes of Ben strafing the world's largest flying boat. Because of my book, in 2009, a gentleman named James Shower got in touch with me. And he'd written a monograph, slim, the volume now sits in the Military Aviation Museum library, where they would like more details and see the whole thing. Anyway, as a boy, he had actually seen the BV-238 on Lake Schall in Germany type thing. And he's always curious what happened to it. He oddly enough became an RAF navigator, particularly involved with photo reconnaissance. And he flew many reconnaissance flights over Germany with the Royal Air Force. Subsequently, after the Royal Air Force, he moved to Canada, which is where he lives now. And he said, there's no way that Ben Drew could have shot down the BV-238. His mission track was over 100 miles away from Lake Schall, and laid out all the facts on what had happened all the way through. What finally happened to the BV-238 is a Canadian squadron flying Tempests strafed it in a canal and sunk it in maybe 1 or 2 feet of water, and the wreckage stayed around until 1947 before they finally removed the rest of it. So the question became, what did Ben and his 2 wingmen actually shoot up? It turns out this was the answer. This is a Potez CIMS 161, a French flying boat, a giant French flying boat. The French had built 3 6-engine flying boats with the intention of setting up transatlantic service. And the war came, of course, and France fell to the Germans. The Luftwaffe co-opted all 3 of those airplanes. And one of these was parked at the Bug seaplane base in the island of Rügen in northern Germany, up near the Danish border off the Baltic coast. So in fact, Ben did sink an extremely large flying boat. I'm not sure if he ever really found out what happened on the aircraft before he was through and had finished it up. Ben Drew, as you can see, he went west, 2 weeks after his 89th birthday. A life well lived, very exceptional. Did get reconciled with his son living in San Diego and got to see his grandchildren, so it was absolutely super time in doing that. So, got questions?
Thank you for taking us on this interesting journey this evening. So far, the only question that's been input, and hopefully people have more questions and we'll be adding them over the next few minutes, was Ben involved with Air America in Vietnam? It sounds like he was supporting the Army Green Berets and the CIA program in Vietnam.
No, this was too early, I think, in the program. This is the French had just lost the Dien Bien Phu period. He still tells story about talking to leftover French military in Saigon Some very interesting outlooks on what should be done in that particular part of the war. Like I say, the only people he knew about carrying were the nationalist Chinese. This was before the U.S. was really involved over in Vietnam.
Okay, folks, this will be the shortest Q&A period. If folks don't have more questions, that's currently the only question that's been asked. Boom, how many flight hours did he amass over his career? Did you ever talk with him about that? Did you have any indication?
No, as a matter of fact, I never did. Never saw his logbooks either. They had disappeared at some point of his wanderings. He was one of these men who had a career up and down. He estimates that he was a millionaire 3 different times. And then he was also broke 3 or 4 different times. Just kind of came and went. He was a boozer, admits that, on and off the wagon. Again, one of those problems you have, like I say, is almost a bigger than life character. I mean, it's small things. You can see this picture of the 375th Squadron is kind of neat. You should have a lot more of the folks in them, but 2 of them you can identify, which is kind of fun. This is Billy Kemp. You'll notice the kind of a brooding, pouty look on the thing and the cap at a weird angle like that. And you say, well, what would Ben look like? Look for the rakiest cap angle of anybody out there. And there's Ben sitting on the far side. Of course, without a necktie, as opposed to guys who are wearing ties. A pair of interesting characters.
Okay, we have picked up a couple of extra questions here. Can you perhaps elaborate on a favorite story that you gathered while creating the book? I know you recently reread it to prepare for the presentation. Was there anything that jumped right out at you as this is just an amazing story?
Yeah, several of them. And I think the one that means the most to me now, because, as you know, I'm lucky enough to fly the Stearman, both the ride program, if we ever get that back again, and just as a general demonstration of the thing. Ben trained on Stearmans out there, and he was training in Mississippi on a base out there. And on one of his solo flights, he's having a great time. And as he describes it, he could even tell me what song he was singing as he's just kind of motoring along. And all of a sudden he looked outside the cockpit down the ground, and he doesn't know where he is. He's lost. I go, okay. So he drops down using an old airmail pilot's trick, looking for a railroad. He follows a railroad to some town, finds the water tower, and flies low enough to read the sign on the water tower to see where he is. Well, he didn't recognize the name of the town at all. As he says, hey, I'm from Detroit. I know nothing about these places down here in Alabama someplace. And anyway, he's flying along, lost, wandering, searching around, and that fuel gauge right in front of his face, which I have a lot of sympathy with now, he's watching that little red disc bob at the bottom of the gauge. And he says, I better put this thing down while I still have some power on the airplane. And does. He picks out a nice small patch someplace and puts the airplane in. On his landing approach, he suddenly realizes there's some high power wires right in front of his nose, and he yanks up on the airplane. It stalls, and it basically thumps into this field. It didn't break anything. And I'm just going, now that I've flown a Stearman, yeah, that was one of those amazing approaches that he actually went through the thing. The subsequent part of that story is he calls the base. They send one of the instructors out with a couple of sergeants to help thing. They drag the airplane back to the other end of this very short field. And one of the sergeants actually looked at Ben and said, hey, kid, he ain't going to make it. And sure enough, the instructor did not make it. The field was too short. He blunders into the trees at the end and flips the airplane over. So for some reason, probably because I fly the Stearman, I always, those are my favorites. Him not getting washed out somehow or another. He figured his life was all over, or getting lost. But afterwards, the supervisor of all the cadets pulled him in and said, you amazing landing that you survived the thing. Your other reports besides the getting lost are good. We're going to continue in training. So one of several times he came close to getting canned.
Interesting story. There's definitely lots of opportunities where people did wash out for similar kinds of activities. Boom. Can you talk a little bit more about how he was able to shoot down the two German jet fighters?
Yeah, he made a point, and I kind of even emphasized it more. He says, after that getting lost episode, he says, I swore I would never, ever get lost again. And for fighter pilots to be able to navigate, it was kind of tough. And bombardiers actually carried a navigator to do the work. The fighter guys just kind of had to study and get used to where they were and study the maps, look around a lot. He thinks it's part of his navigation skills that really helped them. Part of their briefings were, the Germans had this new wonder weapon, this jet airplane. What are they doing with it? And he said, well, where are they? And they'd identified some of the bases, and one of them was called Achmer. It's up near the Dutch border in Germany. And he was on a bomber mission, and at that point, they were given permission to, once their escort duties were over, after they carried the bombers formation so far, they turned the fighters loose. Go after targets of opportunity, do what you want. They're still flying over the thing, and Ben says, we're getting near Achmer. And he looks down, he knows where to look. He's looking down and sees the runway at Achmer. And he sees two Me-262s taking the runway. And he does a favorite trick that a lot of combat pilots have done. He rolls over into the dive, hoping his wingmen are going to follow him. And a couple thousand feet later, he keys the mic and says, hey, Red Leader, I said a couple on the ground, I'm going to go get them. Before asking permission in doing that. So anyway, so he does this high-speed dive in the Mustang. Controls are getting stiff. His speed is way up. His timing was absolutely perfect. First airplane had taken off. The second airplane was just taking off, just lifting off. And it was a straight shot from 6 o'clock. He just put rounds in the thing and the airplane exploded and went. The lead airplane, the flight lead, made a mistake. The flight lead turned. He knew the Mustangs were coming and he started a hard turn to evade them. If he had kept going straight, Ben would have never caught him. His acceleration was such and the speed of the 262 was such he wouldn't have caught him. But he had formerly flown the Messerschmitt 110, a multi-engine fighter. And that was kind of what they did. They went into a defensive circle and did that. So he reefs this thing over into a turn. Not to take away from Ben's skill at this point. So here he is doing over 400 miles an hour. And they're pulling a lot of G, and he's got a high angle deflection shot, one of the most difficult ones you can possibly make, down low and near the ground. And he does it. He manages to pull the lead on him, walks the bullets through the thing. The airplane starts to burst. Next thing you know, it flops over, unlike the wonderful Brian Bateman illustration. The airplane actually went inverted, and somehow miraculously the pilot got out of it, survived the parachute jump, did that. So that's how he got his second one. And then the frustrations began. So that was his kill. So of course he's exultant. Looks around for his wingman, and he can't find either one of them. And he says, I'm going home. Of course, the flak from around Achmer at that point is really incredibly bad. And he heads back to England, basically flies home alone. Gets back to landing there, and he goes, great, I got two jets, I got two jets. And they say, can you confirm it? Well, I can't. And there was 8th Air Force rules for confirmation from a wingman or gun camera film. Gun camera film is normally black and white, but the Air Corps, looking for all kinds of good deals, said, hey, let's try color film for a change. And all the flight leaders on that mission carried color film. And the color film cassettes or size or something was wrong, and they all jammed, including Ben's. So he didn't have photographic proof. The one wingman, Mccandless, had broken off and gone to one side, doing whatever, lost Ben and didn't see what had happened. The other one we already talked about, I'm sorry, I forget the first wingman's name. Mccandless was the guy that became a prisoner of war. He'd seen the whole thing. And of course, how are you going to talk to a prisoner of war? Approval came through, however, and Ben's speculation was they actually gave him credit, within a couple of days of the event. And Ben's suspicion was that what happened is that the commander of the 8th Air Force at the time said, people are getting superstitious really about this jet fighter, this Me-262s. We're going to tell them, we're going to show them that, hey, it can be shot down. and released the word. And then he probably had confirmation through the ultra sources, the cryptology machines, that cracking the German codes. And that's a speculation why they did it there. So maybe that's how he actually shot them down and then wound up getting credit for them. He got a late medal for it too, which I kind of skipped. The Air Force actually pulled him back in 1980, I think it was 2 or 3. The Air Force, now the Air Force, was looking through old records on awards that had been submitted and recommended, but never fully approved for one reason or the other. Welcome to the bureaucracy. And Ben had been put in for a Distinguished Service Cross for the 262 kills. Well, the DSC is an Army award. The Air Force equivalent is an Air Force Cross. And the Air Force said, we're going to give him an Air Force Cross. They pulled him back to Washington. So a little bit late, he was awarded their nation's second highest decoration. Get an Air Force Cross out of it.
It's certainly nice to hear stories about the Air Force going back and kind of making right things that had been previously overlooked. Boom, did he ever indicate to you whether or not he viewed the P-47 or the P-51 as the kind of superior airplane?
Wow, Keegan, we got a couple hours and a few more questionnaires. We're going to go into the thing. Ben's reaction was his first P-47 flying was after he'd gotten his wings. The sequence was he flew Texans, AT-6s, and did that in advance. And they put him in a P-40 for, I think they said 10 hours or something to let him handle a big airplane. And then he was assigned to the Mustang training unit down there in Bartow in Florida, and did so well, as did Billy Kemp, that they, my term was, plowed him back. They made him instructors. Instead of sending them overseas to be combat guys, they kept him there to teach new guys. I mean, he got his thing. He says, "Oh, you passed the fighter course in P-51s. Here you go." And the next day, his 4 second lieutenant students show up, and did that. It probably helped. You read about many of the aces of World War II, and some of the best ones were guys that had a lot more accumulated time back in the States or in the Panama Canal and places like that, flying airplanes where they went to combat. Anyway, while he was at Bartow, they did air-to-air gunnery. And one of the airplanes they used to tow targets on there was an old P-47, see, that would have been a B model, B model, to tow targets. And all the instructors kind of, you can fly anything type thing, and Ben would drag around the sky in this crazy P-47. And he went, "Oh, okay, the dog compared to my Mustang, and absolutely loves his Mustang." So when he came back after his combat tour, I don't know if I mentioned, by the way, it's interesting, you don't look at things like this. He was only in Europe for 5 months. All of that excitement he had and all those kills he got, that was a 5-month tour. He was back in the States. Anyway, they sent him to some desolate duty in Texas, and he hated that, and he didn't want to do that. And talked to an old buddy from the 375th, and he says, "Oh, listen, a partner of mine, a guy I knew from before, is forming a new wing in North Carolina, flying P-47s." And Ben goes, "Oh, P-47s, repulsive thunderbox." He says, "It won't get out of its own way." And this guy goes, No, these are new ones. These are P-47Ns. They changed the wing, they changed the power, changed a couple other things." He said, "Real goers, they're wonderful airplanes. You go do that." So Ben reported down to the new group to fly the P-47. And he says, he got to admit, he was impressed. Of course, this is one of the other times when he managed to get himself in hack kind of inadvertently. The group had already started packing up for the move across the Pacific. And most of the airplanes were gone except for the commanding officers. Of course, you get a brand new spectacular one out there. And he talks to Ben, the new kid, and says, "Okay, take the P-47 up, have fun with it a little bit, don't break it." So Ben just goes out there wandering around, checking out this new airplane. And he says, it really was a different airplane, marvelous airplane. Enjoyed it, and was jumped by a couple of Marine Corps F-7Fs, the twin-engine Tiger Cat, and went after them. And, 2 against 1 wasn't fair. So he slammed the throttle forward into the gate for the water methanol injection to keep the engine cool, and there wasn't any. Almost blew a jug off the airplane and gets it back in there. Enjoyed the airplane. His comments afterwards, he says, a Mustang will always be my favorite, but no, he says P-47 was pretty good. So is that an overall evaluation? No, that was just kind of one man's opinion on the different two airplanes.
Certainly interesting to hear how the airplanes compare in the eyes of obviously combat veteran pilot. Boom, did you
Yep.
ever have the opportunity to fly with Ben?
Yes. Oh, yes. I'm sorry. It was one of the joys out of there. As I say, I met him and found out that he was trying to operate these DC-3s and flying these weekend things. And I said, oh, I mean, that sounds like fun. He says, I need a co-pilot. He had a couple of co-pilots. He had some South African crews, but some of his airplanes had U.S. registry. So technically, they needed guys with U.S. licenses. And there I was, ready to go type thing. So I got checked out. He checked me out. We flew a couple of training flights with me in the right seat of a DC-3, giving me some, so it's legal, I guess you'd call it that. And then what would happen is the hotels, the casinos, would arrange these weekend excursions for their high rollers. It says going up, and you'd say, okay, terrific. You know, you want to go for this weekend? I say, great. And we kind of made up uniforms. That picture you saw before was a little more formal. You know, a couple of epaulettes and a nice short sleeve shirt, and away we went. Anyway, and I'd fly into Lesotho or Swaziland with them, and we'd spend the weekend. There was no sense in taking the airplane back. And it was nice because we were treated like the gamblers, you know, signed everything on a chip. These wonderful weekends, and did those. I did several of them. I showed you the picture of the one where he had two airplanes at the same time, where I got to fly as co-pilot with my wife as flight attendant and Ben in the left seat as the captain. Eventually, we did another one into one of the other countries and took the kids along on that one. So yeah, I got to fly with Ben a lot, several times in the C-47.
So I guess that begs the question, were you ever able to fix the problem he was having as air attaché?
No, I would have had to talk about the CIA. No, no, it never did. And I think it was beyond what I could have done. I mean, even if I could have certified upside down and they would have believed me, as I say, there was kind of a war going on there. The South African Air Force was flying around what would have been his customers to ride in Caprivi. So Caprivi kind of came and went real quick out there, like Sitatunga line, what it was called. The logo on the tail had that nice antelope, which was called a Sitatunga, lived up in the area. So, granted, great adventure for me, but no, the airline never got off the thing.
And boom, we're going to ask just a couple of last questions here. But before we do that, the book is available in the Military Aviation Museum gift shop. There are currently 6 copies down there. You can call in the morning to reserve yours with Tammy. Boom is going to bring a few more over, so we are going to try to up stock. So books will be available following the webinar. Link to purchase them from our online store will be available in the thank you email that you'll all receive in the next day or so. But Boom, if you could, please tell us a little bit more about his advanced flight training, where he graduated, when, and what that graduation kind of meant to him.
Okay, let me skip back for a second here, Keegan, on the another pitch for the book. The best place to buy it, you of course, like all books, can probably find it elsewhere in other bookstores and things, but the best place to get is the museum. And the reason is not so much the fact that I'll autograph the copy for you and sign it, but a lot of what you just heard tonight are inserts that didn't make it to the book as published. I had 1 through 3 pages at the back, explanations on the shooting down of the big thing, the retailing of how I met Ben, and a few other anecdotes and the things. And those are only available at the Military Aviation bookstore shop. So please order them through there and pick them up whenever you can. And like Keegan just kind of mentioned, the new stock just came in. So I'll be adding all those additional pages and scrolling my signature in it and going on from there. You were asking about his advanced training. Well, like I say, it was Texans all the way through and doing that, and a little bit of time in the P-40. I didn't fly a P-39, which kind of surprised me. It seems a lot of the cadets did in those days. He did do that, and as I say, went to Bartow, and then flew more Mustang time all the way through it, I think. So Not much to say about the training. Is they say it was routine, except for things like getting lost way back in the Stearman days and doing dumb things, like running one of these little motorized tugs across the commandant's lawn and one of the other training bases somewhere that cost him. He hadn't been commissioned yet, and he spent a few time marching up and back and down with a pack on his back and a rifle on his shoulder. So they'd wind up doing that.
All right, Boom. Well, that does conclude our list of questions here for this evening, and thank you so very much for your time and for the answers you've provided, as well as the exploration of this impressive flying career that really spanned the globe. Is there anything you'd like to leave us with as we get ready to conclude tonight?
Well, I think you kind of quite finished much of it. And I've already mentioned in there how lucky I consider myself to have run across him and gotten along and doing that. His wife was a dear, knew them all very well, and as I say, did that. So I'll just leave with the thought that, there will never be, I always hate to say this, but somebody's going to jump in. There'll never be another fighter ace. It's just not going to happen. I mean, today's automated stuff and who gets credit for kills and the opportunity is the other thing. It's large air fleets and doing that. There definitely won't be another Ben Drew. An outstanding American in his own right. Really worked out very well.
All righty. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It's certainly much appreciated. Thank you so much.